An old black woman like you thinks she can own a Cadillac, Eric Dalton sneered as he twisted Dorothy Hayes' arm behind her back and snapped on the handcuffs. She had just been discharged from the hospital after heart surgery. The key was in her hand, and the registration bore her name, yet Dalton still called her a thief simply because of her skin color and the car's high price. The crowd filmed as Dorothy fell, while Dalton kicked the evidence beneath the vehicle. He had no idea that the phone call Dorothy requested would bring the county sheriff to the scene. When that man knelt, embraced her, and choked out the word "Mom," who was the real criminal. If you have ever experienced injustice, share your story in the comments. Dorothy Hayes, a 70-year-old black woman who had lived nearly her entire life in Brookdale County, left the hospital with a fresh incision beneath her chest and a wooden cane in her hand. Her cardiologist walked beside her wheelchair all the way to the entrance, repeating what he had already told her twice in the hospital room. No stress, no heavy lifting, no standing for too long. If the pain spread down her left arm, she had to call 911 immediately. Dorothy nodded like an obedient patient, but she understood her body better than any instruction sheet did. It had carried her through 40 years of work, a marriage, a funeral, and the years she had spent raising her son alone. She trusted it to carry her home. On the way home, Dorothy turned into Brookdale Plaza. She only needed to pick up her medication and buy a bouquet of white lilies. That day marked the 6th anniversary of Samuel's death. Her late husband used to bring lilies home whenever he wanted to apologize, even though sometimes he could not remember what he had done wrong. Dorothy parked the black Cadillac Escalade near the pharmacy, turned off the engine, and sat still for a moment to let her heartbeat settle. The vehicle was so new that its paint reflected the sky like a dark mirror. It was a gift from her son. She rarely spoke about it, nor did she explain who her son was. Dorothy had never believed that a woman should have to explain the origin of every good thing she owned merely to make other people feel comfortable. She stepped out of the vehicle slowly, wearing a gray sweater, orthopedic shoes, and the silk scarf Samuel had once bought for her. One hand held her cane while the other rested on the car door. Across the parking lot, Linda Parker, the neighbor who lived 3 houses away from Dorothy and had repeatedly complained about her garden, her visitors, and the music from her home, was sitting inside a silver SUV. Linda had looked at Dorothy for years without ever truly seeing her. But that morning she studied the Cadillac very carefully. Then she looked at Dorothy, then back at the vehicle. In Linda's mind, those two images did not belong in the same story. A woman like Dorothy could not own a vehicle like that. And instead of asking herself where she might be wrong, Linda decided that Dorothy was the one who deserved suspicion. Dorothy did not notice the stare. She entered the pharmacy, collected a paper bag containing 3 bottles of medication, and then stopped at the flower counter. She selected 6 white lilies and asked the employee to tie them with a dark blue ribbon because that had once been Samuel's favorite color. Meanwhile, Linda lowered her car window and called 911. Her voice was calm to the point of coldness, the kind of calm that came from someone who had arranged her words before the person on the other end answered. She reported that an elderly black woman was attempting to steal a Cadillac Escalade at Brookdale Plaza. When the dispatcher asked whether she had seen a weapon, Linda paused. She looked toward the pharmacy entrance and said, "I'm not sure, but she may be armed. Please send someone quickly." Less than 2 miles away, Officer Eric Dalton, a white patrol officer who had served for 4 years and carried far more confidence than experience, received the report over his radio. A vehicle theft involving a possibly armed suspect instantly made his dull morning feel worthwhile. Dalton did not ask whether the caller had seen anyone force open the vehicle, nor did he ask whether the Cadillac's engine was running, whether a window had been broken, or whether the alarm was sounding. He heard only the words that fit the story he was already prepared to believe. Black woman, elderly, luxury vehicle, possibly armed. For Dalton's suspicion quickly hardened into a conclusion. The badge on his chest did not help him see more clearly. It only made his hasty judgment sound like commands. Dorothy left the store with the bag of medication hanging from her wrist and the bouquet of lilies resting against her shoulder. The midday sun poured over the parking lot, making the white petals almost glow. She walked slowly, counting every step as her doctor had instructed. 40 steps to the Cadillac, 20, 10. When she reached it, Dorothy placed the bouquet on the roof, took the key from her purse, and opened the trunk. She did not know that Linda was still watching from the SUV. She did not know that a dishonest phone call had transformed the key in her hand into an instrument of crime. And she did not know that a police officer had already decided she was guilty before he had even seen her face. A siren tore across the parking lot. A patrol car raced through the entrance, forcing two pedestrians to jump backward in alarm. Its tires screeched against the pavement before it stopped diagonally behind the Cadillac, completely blocking its path. Dorothy turned around, her hand still resting on the open trunk. Dalton stepped out before the engine had stopped vibrating, his shoulders rigid, and one hand already positioned on his holster. People nearby began to stop walking. One phone was raised, then another. Dorothy looked at the uniform, looked at the hand near the gun, and felt her newly steadied heartbeat begin pounding beneath the incision. Dalton pointed at her and shouted, "Step away from the stolen vehicle immediately." Dorothy stood beside the Cadillac, holding the key in one hand and supporting herself with her cane in the other. She looked at Dalton's hand resting near his gun, then slowly stepped back as instructed. "Officer, this is my vehicle," she said, her voice calm, even as her heartbeat pounded against the incision. "I have the key, my identification, and the registration in my purse. If you give me permission, I will take them out." Dalton did not look at the key in her hand. He studied her face as though the explanation itself were a carefully prepared trick. "Do not reach into your purse." Dalton stepped closer. "Put the key on the ground and raise your hands." Dorothy bent down very slowly, but the strain on her incision forced her to stop halfway. She placed the key beside the tire, then straightened up again, her breathing shorter than before. "The documents will resolve this in a few seconds. Or you could be reaching for a gun," Dalton replied. His words were loud enough for the people near the pharmacy entrance to hear. One person stopped pushing a shopping cart. Two others took out their phones. Within moments, a loose semicircle had formed around them. Dalton looked Dorothy up and down. The gray sweater was worn at the cuffs. Her orthopedic shoes had thick soles. The wooden cane was scratched from years of use. Then he looked at the gleaming black Cadillac Escalade behind her. "You expect me to believe this vehicle belongs to you?" The corner of his mouth curled upward. "Do you have any idea how much it costs?" Dorothy tightened her hand around the cane's handle. She had heard that tone in many different forms at checkout counters, inside banks, and outside the homes where she had once worked. "I know how much my vehicle is worth," she replied. "And my name is on the registration." No one in the crowd stepped forward. They stood close enough to see Dorothy's hand trembling, yet far enough away to convince themselves that the situation had nothing to do with them. Phones were raised one after another. Some people recorded Dalton. Others filmed only the elderly black woman standing beside the luxury vehicle, as though that contrast were the part worth watching. Linda remained seated inside the silver SUV at the edge of the parking lot, her face obscured behind the windshield. She no longer needed to say anything else. Her lie had put on a uniform and was now moving forward on its own. Caleb Turner, a young delivery worker unloading cases of water near the convenience store, set down the box in his hands. He had watched long enough to see the key lying beside the tire and that Dorothy had not resisted. Officer Caleb spoke up, "You only need to run the license plate. If the vehicle is registered to her, everything will be clear." Dalton slowly turned his head. "You are interfering with an investigation. I'm only suggesting that you check. Step back or you'll be arrested with her." Caleb swallowed hard and took one step backward. But instead of leaving, he took out his phone, began live streaming, and aimed the camera directly at the scene. A second patrol car entered the parking lot. Rachel Moore, a female officer who had been on the job for less than a year, stepped out and quickly assessed the scene. She saw an elderly woman, a key on the ground, and no sign of a break-in. Dorothy was struggling to remain upright. Her shoulders rose with each labored breath. Rachel was about to ask whether Dalton had checked the documents, but the look in his eyes stopped the question. Dalton had more seniority and was in charge of the scene. Rachel placed a hand on her belt and stood to one side. Her silence did not create the injustice, but it gave that injustice more room to continue. "I had heart surgery 6 days ago," Dorothy said. "I cannot stand for long. I need this cane to keep my balance." Dalton looked down at the hand gripping the cane. In his eyes, everything Dorothy possessed could be turned into evidence against her. "Put it down. I will fall." "I said put it down." Before Dorothy could release it, Dalton stepped forward and kicked the shaft of the cane hard. It flew from her hand, struck the pavement with a sharp clatter, and spun beneath the vehicle beside them. Dorothy staggered, one hand grasping at the air, before catching the hood of the Cadillac. A sharp pain tore through her chest, forcing her to bend forward. Dalton pulled the handcuffs from his belt. The metallic click, as they opened, echoed across the silent parking lot. "Dorothy Hayes, you are being detained on suspicion of armed vehicle theft." The click of the handcuffs opening made Dorothy raise her head. She still had one hand braced against the hood of the Cadillac, struggling to remain upright, as the pain beneath her incision had not yet subsided. Please, she said between broken breaths. I had heart surgery 6 days ago. Don't pull my arms behind my back. You can handcuff me in front or let me sit down while you check the documents. Dalton did not answer. He stepped forward and seized her wrist as though her plea were merely a delaying tactic. Dorothy looked toward Rachel, hoping the young officer would say something. Rachel shifted her feet slightly but remained where she was. Dalton yanked Dorothy's right arm away from the hood and violently twisted it behind her back. The incision pulled tight, as though an invisible cord were tearing it open from within. Dorothy gasped and her knees buckled, but Dalton kept her upright by gripping her arm tightly. I can't move my arm that far, she said. Please, you're hurting me. He pulled her other wrist behind her, forced her shoulders together, and closed the first handcuff. The cold steel edge tightened around her thin skin. The second cuff snapped shut even more tightly, cutting into her left wrist. A small drop of blood appeared bright red against the silver metal. Dorothy let out a groan as Dalton pulled her wrists higher. Stop. I'm not resisting. Dalton immediately raised his voice so that every phone around them would capture it. Stop resisting, he shouted. The words rang across the parking lot like a pre-written accusation. They did not describe what Dorothy was doing. They created a story that benefited the man placing her in handcuffs. The people standing nearby looked at one another. Several phones were held more firmly. On Caleb's screen, the number of live stream viewers climbed by the dozens, while Dorothy struggled to remain motionless, determined not to give Dalton any movement he could distort. As Dalton turned Dorothy away from the vehicle, the strap of her purse slipped from her shoulder. The bag fell onto the pavement and burst open. The Cadillac key bounced once before coming to rest beside the front tire. 3 prescription bottles rolled in different directions. Dorothy's identification landed face up while the vehicle registration slid near the toe of Dalton's shoe. Beneath the sunlight, the black lettering was clearly visible: Dorothy Elaine Hayes, Cadillac Escalade. License plate BKH 417. Caleb lowered his phone slightly to look at the plate on the back of the vehicle. BKH 417. Not a single character was different. The documents are right beneath your feet, Caleb shouted. Her name matches the registration, and the license plate matches too. The vehicle belongs to her. Take off the handcuffs. A murmur spread through the crowd. Rachel bent down and also saw Dorothy's name, the Cadillac's information, and the valid license plate number. She looked up, her lips parting as though she were about to speak. It would take only one sentence. She only needed to tell Dalton to stop and verify the information. But her eyes once again turned toward the more senior officer, waiting for him to make a decision that the evidence had already made for him. Dalton looked at the registration. For one moment, his grip on Dorothy loosened slightly. He had seen the name. He had seen the license plate. He also understood that dozens of cameras were waiting to see what he would do next. He could pick up the document, verify it, and admit that he had acted too quickly. But doing so would mean removing the handcuffs from the woman he had just publicly mocked. The truth lay directly beneath Dalton's feet, and his pride stood between him and it. He chose his pride. Dalton used the toe of his shoe to push the registration aside. The document slid across the pavement and disappeared beneath the nearby vehicle, coming to rest in the shadows beside Dorothy's cane. The documents could have been stolen with the vehicle, he said. Caleb stared at him in disbelief. Rachel lowered her head. At the edge of the parking lot, Linda had stepped out of her silver SUV to get a better view. When she saw the evidence being kicked away, a faint smile appeared on her lips. Linda did not know that Caleb's camera was pointed directly at her, capturing both her face and her look of satisfaction. Let's go. Dalton grabbed Dorothy's arm and pulled her toward the patrol car. Without her cane and with her hands restrained behind her back, she could only take short, unsteady steps. Slow down, Dorothy pleaded. I can't keep my balance. Dalton continued jerking her forward. The toe of Dorothy's orthopedic shoe caught on a raised painted line. Her knees buckled and her entire body pitched violently forward, with no hands available to break her fall. She struck the pavement, and the sound of the impact made the entire crowd hold its breath. A few steps away, her bottle of heart medication continued rolling, crossed the parking line, and finally came to rest beyond her reach. Dorothy lay on her side on the pavement, her hands still restrained behind her back, leaving her unable to brace herself. The fall sent a violent surge of pain from her knee into her chest. She tried to turn over, but the edges of the handcuffs immediately cut deeper into her bleeding wrists. Near the Cadillac, the bouquet of white lilies slid from the roof. Someone in the crowd stepped backward to get a better camera angle and crushed the flowers beneath the shoe. White petals stuck to the pavement, mangled beneath the sole. Dorothy saw them and thought of Samuel. She had come there only to collect her medication and bring flowers home for her husband. Now even that had been crushed before her eyes. "Get up!" Dalton grabbed Dorothy by the arm and pulled her upward. She cried out in pain, her feet unable to find their balance. "I can't. My cane. Stop putting on an act," he interrupted. "You fell because you refused to follow orders." Dorothy tried to explain that she had just undergone heart surgery, but Dalton hauled her upright as though lifting a heavy object. He did not return her cane or allow her to retrieve her medication. In his eyes, every sign of pain was an act because acknowledging that it was real would mean admitting that he had caused it. Dalton dragged Dorothy toward the patrol car. The rear door opened, releasing a wave of heat trapped beneath the sun. He shoved her onto the seat, ignoring the way her shoulder struck the doorframe. The air inside was thick, and the smell of hot plastic and metal made Dorothy nauseated. She bent forward, trying to press her chest toward her knees so she could breathe, but the handcuffs prevented her from adjusting her body. "Please open the door," she said through the glass. "I can't breathe." Dalton slammed it shut. The lock engaged with a sharp click. Within seconds, sweat was already running from Dorothy's temples down her neck. Rachel approached, looked through the window, and saw Dorothy clutching her chest with her hands restrained behind her back. "Dalton, we should call an ambulance." "There's no need. She just had heart surgery." Dalton turned toward her, lowering his voice into a warning. "I'm in charge of this scene. She only wants to delay being taken to the station. Don't interfere." Rachel looked at Dorothy's pale face, then at the badge on Dalton's chest. Once again, she stepped back. Outside, Caleb continued aiming his phone at the patrol car. The live stream had surpassed 3,000 viewers. Thousands of people were watching an elderly woman being left inside a hot vehicle. But the person with the authority to open the door had turned his back. The pain in Dorothy's chest began spreading down her left arm. Her doctor's warning returned with perfect clarity. If the pain spread down her arm, she had to call 911 immediately. She knocked her shoulder against the window. "I want to make a phone call." Dalton did not turn around. "You can make one at the station." Dorothy pressed her cheek against the hot glass and forced herself to speak louder. "I may not be alive by the time we get there." The statement caused several people in the crowd to lower their phones. "Every camera here is recording you denying me medical assistance and refusing my phone call. If I die inside this vehicle, that will be your decision." Dalton hesitated, but he still did not open the door. Rachel did. She hurried forward, pulled open the rear door, and knelt beside Dorothy. Up close, it was impossible to call this an act. Dorothy's skin had turned gray, her lips were pale, and her breaths were short and broken. "Who do you want to call?" Rachel asked. "Family and attorney." Dorothy raised her head. There was still a calmness in her exhausted eyes that instinctively made Rachel sit straighter. "My son." Because Dorothy's hands remained cuffed, Rachel took out her own phone and opened the keypad. Dorothy recited 10 digits one at a time, slowly, but without a single mistake. The phone rang once. Dalton stood nearby and snorted. She thinks her son is going to save her. A second ring. Caleb moved closer, sensing that the atmosphere around the patrol car had just changed. A third ring. A man's deep, decisive voice answered. "Hayes." Dorothy closed her eyes. For the first time since she had been stopped, her voice softened. "Marcus, it's Mom. I need you to come to Brookdale Plaza right now." Rachel froze. She knew that voice. Every officer in the county knew it. Marcus Hayes was the man whose signature appeared on her appointment order, the head of the entire Brookdale County Sheriff's Office. And the woman bleeding inside this patrol car had just called him her son. Rachel was still holding the phone to Dorothy's ear when the roar of approaching engines echoed from the entrance to Brookdale Plaza. 3 black sheriff's SUVs raced into the parking lot, their red and blue lights flashing across the storefront windows. The first blocked the eastern exit, the second sealed off the road leading to the boulevard. The last stopped sideways behind Dalton's patrol car. Command officers stepped out and immediately spread across the area, never once looking at the Cadillac as though it were the scene of a theft. They were searching for a person. The crowd instinctively parted, phones still raised, but all conversation silenced. Sheriff Marcus Hayes stepped out of the lead vehicle. He wore a dark blue uniform with a silver badge, positioned neatly on his chest. At first, Marcus's face revealed nothing beyond the cold focus of a man accustomed to controlling crises. His gaze swept across the parking lot, registering every detail. A bottle of heart medication lay beside a painted line. A wooden cane had been kicked beneath a vehicle. The Cadillac's registration rested in the shadows nearby. 6 white lilies had been crushed, their dark blue ribbons stuck to the pavement. Marcus recognized the color of that ribbon. His mother used it every year when she brought flowers home for his father. Then Marcus looked into the rear seat of the patrol car. Dorothy was slumped beside the open door, her hands still restrained behind her back. Her face was ashen. Sweat had plastered her gray hair to her forehead. Blood ran in a thin line from her wrist to her fingers. For 1 second, the sheriff did not move. His usually hardened expression seemed to crack beneath the weight of what he was seeing. "Mom," the word tore from Marcus's mouth, stripped of command and authority, leaving only the naked terror of a son. He ran through the crowd and dropped onto both knees on the scorching pavement. "Mom, it's me. Look at me." Marcus cradled Dorothy's face, checked her breathing, and then looked at the handcuffs. "The key," he said. No one reacted quickly enough. Marcus raised his head, his voice low and cold. "Take the handcuffs off my mother. Now." Rachel's hands trembled as she took the key from her belt. When the steel rings came away from Dorothy's wrists, deep dark red marks were revealed with the skin torn open on one side. Marcus lifted her hands with extraordinary gentleness, as though one forceful movement might cause her to break apart. Before dozens of cameras, he lowered his head and pressed his lips to each injured wrist. Dalton stood several steps away as all the color gradually drained from his face. He looked at Dorothy, then at Marcus, and then at the Hayes nameplate on the sheriff's chest. The story he had constructed began collapsing around him. Sir Dalton began, "I was responding to a report of an armed vehicle theft." She matched the description. Marcus slowly rose to his feet. That slowness was more frightening than an outburst of rage. "What description?" "An elderly black woman beside a Cadillac." Marcus looked directly at him. "So the only description was an elderly black woman. And to you, that was enough to call her a thief." Dalton tried to say more, but Marcus gave him no place to hide behind excuses. "Did you run the license plate?" Dalton remained silent. "Did you read the registration bearing her name?" Marcus's gaze shifted toward the document that had been kicked beneath the vehicle. "Or did you see it and push it into the shadows?" A murmur passed through the crowd. Dalton swallowed hard. The documents could have been stolen with the vehicle. Marcus turned toward the Cadillac. "That vehicle was not stolen. I bought it for my mother on the day I was appointed sheriff of Brookdale County." Marcus's voice grew hoarse, but every word remained clear. Dorothy had raised him alone after his father became unable to work. During the day, she worked in a school cafeteria. At night, she mopped floors and emptied trash cans in office buildings where people rarely remembered her name. Some nights, Dorothy came home at 2 in the morning with her hands cracked from cleaning chemicals, then woke before dawn to prepare breakfast for her son. "I bought that Cadillac because she spent her entire life walking into places where people looked at her clothes before they looked at her face," Marcus said. "I wanted my mother to have something beautiful without needing anyone's permission. But today you forced her to prove ownership with her blood." Marcus turned toward the command officers. His anger finally broke through the control in his eyes. "Arrest Dalton for assault, unlawful detention, and concealment, Marcus." Dorothy's voice was weak but strong enough to stop him. She placed a hand on her son's arm. "Do not let me watch you become like him." Marcus looked down at her. "Mom, he could have killed you. Then use the truth, not your anger. Power only has meaning when you use it to do what is right." Marcus closed his eyes for a second, then nodded. When he stood upright again, the wounded son had stepped back behind the sheriff. He turned toward Dalton and said, "Now, we are going to review every second of what you did to my mother." Marcus did not need to take Dalton back to the station to determine what had happened. Dalton's and Rachel's body cameras were still recording, and Caleb's live stream had captured most of the incident from a different angle. A command officer played the footage at the scene. On the screen, Dalton looked down at the registration bearing Dorothy Hayes' name, saw that the license plate matched the Cadillac, and then deliberately kicked the document beneath the vehicle. That moment destroyed every excuse that this had been an innocent mistake. Dalton had seen the truth. He had simply chosen to conceal it. Marcus turned toward Dalton. "Move both hands away from your belt." 2 officers stepped forward. "Surrender your weapon, radio, and badge. You are suspended immediately, pending an investigation into excessive use of force, unlawful detention, concealment of evidence, and denial of medical assistance." Dalton's hands trembled as he removed each item. When he reached the badge, he hesitated. "Sir, please reconsider. I have a wife and 2 children. Losing this job will destroy my family." Marcus looked at him coldly. "You have mentioned your family, your career, and everything you are about to lose. But not once have you asked whether the woman bleeding over there is going to survive. You are not afraid of what you did. You are only afraid of the consequences for yourself." Rachel stepped out of the line of officers and admitted that she had seen Dorothy lose her balance. seen the heart medication fall to the ground, and recognized that she was struggling to breathe. She had suggested calling an ambulance, but had backed down when Dalton ordered her to. "I knew something was wrong," Rachel said. I still remained silent. Marcus ordered Internal Affairs to investigate both Dalton's conduct and the silence of those who had a duty to intervene. He then publicly thanked Caleb. The young man had no badge or authority, yet he was the only person who had repeatedly demanded that Dalton examine the evidence while everyone else merely stood there recording. At the edge of the parking lot, Linda quietly opened the door of her silver SUV. One of the livestream viewers immediately recognized her as the woman who had smiled when the registration was kicked away. Caleb replayed the video, clearly revealing Linda's face. At the same time, dispatch sent over the recording of the 911 call. In it, Linda admitted that Dorothy lived near her, yet still claimed that she was stealing the Cadillac and might be armed, despite having seen no gun or sign of forced entry. Marcus ordered Linda detained pending an investigation into filing a false report and deliberately endangering another person. An ambulance entered the parking lot. The paramedics placed Dorothy on a stretcher, bandaged her wrist, and connected her to a monitor. The irregular heartbeat displayed on the screen confirmed that she needed to be taken to the hospital immediately. Dalton approached now without his weapon or badge. "Mrs. Hayes, I'm sorry." Dorothy looked at him through the oxygen mask. "You are afraid, but fear of consequences is not remorse. Remorse begins when you understand what you have done to someone else." Before the ambulance doors closed, Dorothy held Marcus's hand. "Punishing Dalton and Linda will not be enough," she said. "I want to change the policies that allow this to happen. Not only for me, but for the next person who does not have a son serving as sheriff." Dorothy remained in the hospital for 3 days. The doctors confirmed that the heat, the fall, and having her arms restrained behind her back had placed dangerous stress on her recently operated heart. But by the morning of the 3rd day, her heartbeat had stabilized. While Dorothy recovered, Caleb's live stream surpassed 10 million views. Reporters crowded the sidewalk outside the hospital. Online, thousands of people demanded the same thing in prison. Dalton punished Linda and turned them into a warning for everyone else. Marcus sat beside his mother's bed, still wearing his uniform after a sleepless night. He said he could make sure Dalton was never allowed to work in any public agency again. Dorothy remained silent, then placed her hand over her son's. "If you only destroy him, what will everyone else learn?" Marcus did not answer. "They will not learn to respect the public. They will only learn not to target the mother of someone powerful." She looked directly at him. "I do not want justice to appear only when the victim has the right phone number to call." Dorothy demanded that every vehicle ownership dispute be verified through the license plate identification or registration before anyone was placed in handcuffs. Body cameras had to remain active throughout every interaction between police officers and citizens. Every request for medical assistance from an elderly person or someone with an underlying health condition had to be evaluated immediately and could not be dismissed with the accusation that the person was pretending. She also proposed establishing an independent civilian board with the authority to review footage, receive complaints, and require law enforcement to answer for its conduct. Rachel voluntarily testified before Internal Affairs. She did not conceal the fact that she had recognized Dorothy was in danger, but had still stepped back because she was afraid of defying Dalton's orders. Her testimony helped the investigation establish that the silence of those with a duty to act must also be subject to scrutiny. Caleb was invited to become the first civilian member of the new oversight board. Linda was charged with making a false report and deliberately creating the perception of an armed threat. Dalton lost his law enforcement certification after the video proved that he had used excessive force, denied medical assistance, and deliberately kicked valid evidence into the shadows. As the investigation neared its conclusion, Marcus brought the findings to his mother. He thought Dorothy could finally rest. But after reading them, she closed the file and made a request that left him stunned. Dorothy wanted to meet with Dalton privately before the final ruling was completed. No reporters, no live stream, no uniforms, and above all, no cameras anywhere in the room. Dorothy met with Dalton in a small room without cameras. She did not say that she forgave him, nor did she condemn him with angry words. She told him about the years she had spent cleaning offices at night and all the times people had seen her skin color before they saw her face. Throughout her life, Dorothy had always feared the gaze of someone in uniform who viewed her as a threat. Dalton had looked at her with that very gaze when she was 70 years old and too weak to stand without her cane. "You were not born with that prejudice," Dorothy said. "Someone taught it to you. But when the registration was lying at your feet, you had an opportunity to choose the truth. Instead, you chose to protect your prejudice. Dalton lowered his head. For the first time, he did not mention his wife and children, his career, or everything he had lost. He admitted that he had known the evidence could prove Dorothy's innocence, but had still kicked it away because he was afraid to admit that he had been wrong. I turned you into a threat, so I would not have to confront the person I had become, he said. Dorothy did not promise to forgive him. She said remorse was not proven by tears inside a private room, but by the actions a person continued to take after no one was left to force them to do what was right. 6 months later, Brookdale County announced the Hays Standard mandatory document verification before any arrest in an ownership dispute, continuous body camera recording throughout every encounter, and oversight authority granted to a civilian board. Rachel became an instructor who trained new officers in their duty to intervene when colleagues abused their authority. Caleb continued representing the community on the board. 1 year later, Dorothy stood at the podium inside the police academy. Behind her was a photograph of the vehicle registration lying in the shadows beneath the car. She looked at the new officers and asked what they would do if the person in handcuffs did not have a son who was sheriff, had no live stream, and had no convoy coming to the rescue. The room fell silent, but this time it was not the silence of indifference. It was the silence of people being forced to confront their own choices. After the talk, Marcus took his mother back to Brookdale Plaza. He bought a new bouquet of white lilies for her to place on his father's grave. Dorothy set the flowers on the passenger seat and drove the Cadillac out of the parking lot herself. She was no longer the woman who had been forced to prove that she deserved to own the vehicle. She had become the woman who made the entire county reconsider how power was used. But the question Dorothy left behind was not only for the police. When an innocent person is humiliated before your eyes, will you remain silent and wait for someone powerful to rescue them, or will you be the first to step forward before it is too late?